tonight I wanted to share with you something, it's a little different, but it's about contentment. Contentment. Is there a word in Afrikaans that I can use for contentment? Tevrede. Tevredenheid. Okay, tevrede of tevredenheid. Vervulling. But do you guys all understand the term contentment? You understand what it means to be content versus being discontent? The person who is discontent is never, is glad nie vervul nie. Hy is nie tevrede nie. Nothing is ever good enough. He's discontent. Now, in the beginning of each year, we see almost the entire world hanging their hopes on high and lofty dreams. Like when you get to the 1st of January, everybody's got so much hope for this next year. And when you try to go work out in the gym, you can never find space in the gym. You know what I'm talking about? Because first of the year, everybody is, they got all of their priorities stacked up and they're ready to have a really wonderful year. And then by March, there's nobody there. It's empty again, right? But an online article called GoSkills.com listed the 2022's most common New Year's resolutions. And I wanted to read to you some of them. The most popular ones were exercise more. That's what people had for their New Year's resolutions. Lose more weight. Get more organized. Save more money. Spend more time with family and friends. Travel more. Read more. So when I was reading through that, I thought, out of the top New Year's resolutions, all of them had the word more in it. More of everything in order to be fulfilled in 2022. Everything is about getting more, having more, achieving more, experiencing more. And I believe that while everybody's getting obsessed with more of everything, I believe that God has called us to become content with a life He has already afforded you. Contentment is a powerful spiritual exercise. Because in fact, it is a type of worshiping God for what He has already done for us. Has there ever been a time in history that humans have been more discontent than what they are already? I mean, think about how discontent people are. And I currently live in a city right next to Chicago. It's actually part of Chicago, but it's Schaumburg, West Dundee. It doesn't matter. Right there in Chicago, I can't believe when you drive through the city just how discontent people are about absolutely everything. We lived there for 2 years in the downtown area, and there wasn't a day when people were not marching, where people were not rioting, where they were not complaining about anything. It's called the gospel of grievance. You can go to almost any church in Chicago today, and they'll be preaching about their grievances they have with the government, with certain people groups. They will always complain about, and it's called the gospel of grievance. That's what we've coined it. I mean, consider that cars are more luxurious today than ever, faster today than ever. People live longer now than in previous generations. We have bigger economies now than ever. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we now have more millionaires and billionaires and multi-billionaires in the world than ever. Opportunity is greater than ever. We have more of just about anything you can think of. More time and more money is spent today on entertainment than in the history of humanity. And in spite of all of this progress, and all of these conveniences, and all of this entertainment, people are now more dissatisfied than ever. Nothing is good enough for anybody anymore. And I found that to be very concerning. They're discontent. But I want to present you with a thought. Lucifer was first discontent before he strategized to change the role that God has given him. He became discontent in the role that God gave him. Then he fell into sin. Think about Adam and Eve. Eve was first discontent, thinking that God is withholding something from her. And then she fell into sin. Discontentment leads to many, many evils in our society and in our lives individually. Think about it. The thief was first discontent with what he had. Then he began to steal. The drunkard was first discontent with his life. Then he began to drink. The drug addict was first discontent with where he's at and how he felt, and then he started taking drugs and shooting up. The power-hungry politician became discontent with his position that he had, the influence that he had, and then he began to lie even more, to sell even more lies. Discontentment is always, precedes many, many great evils in our society and in our personal lives. So the question I have is, can an imperfect human be content? Is it even possible for me to be content while living with the family that I live with, part of the community where I'm in, attending a church that I'm at, under a government that does exist? Is it possible to be content in a broken world? Well, according to the Apostle Paul, it is. Because the Apostle Paul said this in Philippians 4, verse 11, "Not that I speak from need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." You see, the power of the Apostle Paul's statement here is amplified when you realize his current circumstances. He said, "I've learned to be content." Now, if he was living in a palace and he had made that claim, we'd all say, like, well, yeah, you've learned to be content because you live in circumstances that are more conducive than mine. But if you understand his circumstances, you'll understand that that statement is pretty powerful, because he was, in fact, not sitting on a beach somewhere in George, South Africa, drinking pina coladas all day long. No, he wasn't. He wasn't in paradise. He was in prison. And he made the statement, and he said, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I'm in." He was a prisoner in chains, surrounded by criminals when he said that. So the question is, why was it possible for Paul to be content in those circumstances? He said he learned it. It's a learned skill, not a natural bent. Because we naturally bend towards discontentment. But here Paul's telling us, wait a minute, it's a learned skill. So the question is, why was it possible for Paul to be content in those circumstances? He deliberately tells us that his circumstances were not determined by, what was determined by contentment was not his circumstances. Let me say it again. He's deliberately telling us that his contentment was specifically not linked to his circumstances. Look again at Philippians 4, 11, 12. It says, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. I know how to get along with little, and I also know how to live in prosperity." Wow. Very often, it's the prosperity that makes people discontent. I'll show you in a little bit. He says, "But in any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need." So if your contentment is dependent upon your circumstances today, family, you will never be able to be content. Your circumstances keep changing. You'll be content for a little, discontent for a lot. Discontent a little bit, or content for a little bit, discontent again after you've lost whatever made you content, because circumstances change. So how did Paul become content? Well, he did not say, I received the Holy Ghost and I started speaking in tongues, and since that day I was content. You see, he did not say that. It was obviously not because of his convenience, his comfort, his environment, or because everything was going his way. No, Paul was very clear that I've learned to be content, and that is how I became content. It's very clear to us that his contentment was an inside job and not an outward circumstance. It didn't matter if you lived in the Garden of Eden, you cannot be content if you have internal conflict. If you have internal conflict, it wouldn't matter that you have the most thoughtful spouse, you will not be content in your marriage. If you have internal conflict, it wouldn't matter if you had a healthy body. Contentment couldn't be yours. If you had internal conflict, it wouldn't matter if you got a promotion, the one that you've always been waiting for, and you got the corner office on the job. It wouldn't matter. Nothing matters on the outside if you are conflicted on the inside, because you will end up being discontent. And that's why most people are discontent, because they are searching for outside circumstances to change, when in fact God has called the internal parts of who they are to change. Somebody said, well, Jacques, I have no idea how anybody then could be content all the time. Well, the truth is, you can dislike your politics in South Africa and still be a content individual. You can be angry at your kids if you're a parent and still be a content individual. See, you can be frustrated with your spouse and still be a content individual. Because discontentment does not mean you are always only happy. There is no such individual and there's no such person or scenario. It doesn't mean to be, because discontentment does not mean you never have any other emotion. No, you have an array of emotions as a very content individual. To be discontent means you want to have something. It has to do with your desire. You want to have something else, something other than what God has already given you. In other words, you want something God hasn't given you, and you desire it from either Him or someone else. You want to be with somebody other than you currently are. You want to go somewhere else where God does not currently have you. In other words, what you have is not for you, is not enough for you. Who you are with is not special enough to you. Where you are is simply not where you want to be. And Paul, on the other hand, learned contentment by learning to be grateful for what he does have. He learned contentment by learning to love who he is with, even though they were prisoners. He learned to be content by learning to be satisfied in the moment and place where God currently has him. He was satisfied with the providence of God instead of with his own covetousness or his own desires. That means every time things go wrong for you, this is an opportunity for you to say, I can learn to be content when I learn to love where God currently has me. I have to learn to love where God currently has me. I have to learn to love those people God currently has placed in my life. If you start making a list, there are many people in your life. Are you actively learning to love them? Or are you one of those people that I can't wait to be with somebody other than the people God has placed me with? I always say to young people, God never told you to marry the person you love. God told you to learn to love the person you're married to. It's when you say, I do, you're telling God, I commit to learn to love this person that I'm with. And that's really what God has called us to do. He didn't call you to move next to the person that you love. He says, love the neighbor that you have. And so we have to learn to love sacrificially. We have to learn contentment. Not just where we are, where we live, who we are with, but also the life that God has given us. I mean, if you can think about 500 years ago, 100 years ago, if people had an opportunity to peek through a window and see the kind of conveniences in the lives that we could live or that we are living today, if they were able to see our lives, they would become so discontent with the life that they have because our lives are amazing. It's amazing if you think about it that way. But we don't, and we are never content with what we have. So we don't live grateful before the Lord. So what is contentment? What is contentment? A.W. Pink, one of my favorite authors, wrote this, quote, "Contentment is being satisfied with the sovereign dispensations of God's providence." He continues and he says, contentment is the opposite of murmuring. While murmuring is in fact the spirit of rebellion. Remember the children of Israel in the desert? It says murmuring, and the opposite of contentment, in other words, discontentment, is the clay saying to the potter, "Why hast thou made me thus?" Instead of complaining at his lot, a contented man is thankful that his condition and circumstances are no worse than what they are. So the discontent person is like the clay shouting at the potter, "Why are you making me like this?" While the content person is saying, "Thank God for the life I have. It could have been much worse, but here I am." Instead of complaining at his lot, a content man is thankful for the condition and circumstances that they are no worse than what they are. Instead of greedily desiring something more than the supply of his present need, he rejoices that God still cares for him. Such a one is content with such as he has. Hebrews 13 verse 5 says, "Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have." Being content with what you have. You don't see that today anymore. So I want to end this portion of what I wanted to share with you today by concluding that contentment actually is the opposite of complaining. It's the opposite of murmuring. I don't allow my children to walk around complaining in my house. They're not allowed to murmur. They're not allowed to do that. And I remember when I used to do it a lot, and I've had to unlearn murmuring. I had to unlearn complaining. I had to unlearn being bummed out all day about everything. You know what I'm talking about? No, you guys never bummed out. I remember. You guys have load shedding. Yeah. All I can tell you is load shedding sometimes seems like, because I view it from America, I'm like, oh, these South Africans on my Facebook feed is, complaining about their load shedding. And I'm thinking, I just wish sometimes that everything can shut down. I really do. I really do. So my wife and I, we started doing this on Friday nights. Instead of putting the TV on and we're watching another TV show, we're watching another movie with the kids. When we put it off, they complain because they want to watch even more. I'm like, seriously, I let you guys watch TV and then you complain when we end it. Like, how about not watching TV at all? All right, then at least you won't complain that we put it off. You know. And so what we do now is, on Friday nights, we put candlelight. We put all of our lights off and we put candles on. And we tell stories around the candlelight. And I tell my kids about how I grew up on in a farm in northern Transvaal. And Andia and I, we didn't have, I think I was at least 6 or 7 years old before we actually got a generator, where this generator would run 1 hour a night just to keep the fridge cold. And in that 1 hour, we had the fridge running, we had one lamp, one light, and we had a tiny little black and white TV. It was glorious. Because we didn't know what all we missed out on, you know. So contentment is the opposite of complaining and murmuring. I had to learn this. I had to learn to undo the complaining and undo the murmuring. I remember walking around, and I'm just like, oh, this is going on again. And, you know, in a pastor's life, I can tell you now, you can ask Pastor Flip, it's not often that things go well. It's not often that things work out. I mean, everything can go right, and then the microphone doesn't work. Everything can go right, and then somebody leaves the church. Everything can go right, and then there's a funeral. Everything can go right, but there's always something, isn't there? Always. And so I'm walking around, and I'm just like, and then my kids walk in, and I'm barking at them, and I'm like, this is not going well. This is not going well. I'm like, Tina, did you see it? And then she's making breakfast. And when the breakfast was finished, she shouts from the other side of the house, Pastor Pathetic, the breakfast is ready. Like, what did you say? Anyway, then I'm walking around complaining about my wife. She's calling me Pastor Pathetic. One more thing to complain about. But true story, I had to unlearn this, and I realized that the conclusion is that contentment is then the heart that rests in God's sovereignty. It's the heart that rests in the fact that He is God, and the fact that I can trust that He is ordering my steps, but He's not. When we say God is ordering my steps, it's always that we grab onto that as a promise. Yeah, I believe that God's going to order my steps. I'm going to go to the right college. I'm going to marry the right person. I'm going to get on the right career path. I'm going to do the right thing. Well, how about in the past? Did God not order your steps all the way up to here? Well, I got to believe both ways, that God is ordering my steps, and that He did order my steps. And therefore, here I am. Thank you, God. You've ordered my steps. How about starting to trust Him? Because without trusting Him, you couldn't be content. Does He not say He works all things for the good to those who love Him and are called according to what? His purposes. Here I am in your purpose. I assume this is there for your purpose. How else could I trust Him? What does trust mean if that's not what trust is? Do you follow what I'm saying? Yeah, but a lot of hardship has taken place. I know. God works all things for the good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Many people are not in God's purposes, but you are, because you love Him and you are called according to His purposes. Amen.